The year is 1944. The skies over the Mediterranean are a furious kaleidoscope of smoke, fuel and fire. The name of Lieutenant Louis Edward Curdes was, at that time, already beginning to be whispered among the pilots of the 1st Fighter Group of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Curdes, a lean, sharp-eyed native of Fort Wayne, Indiana, was not the typical boastful fighter pilot. He was a methodical, disciplined flyer, trained in the art of geometric warfare, where an inch of altitude and a fraction of a second in timing meant the difference between life and a fiery death. He was flying the legendary North American P-51 Mustang, a machine that was not merely an aircraft, but a symbol of American air superiority. Capable of turning the tide of the air war over Europe, Curdes' journey to ace status was swift and brutal. His operational career began in the chaotic, sun-drenched skies over Italy and Sardinia, where the remnants of the German Luftwaffe and the Italian Regia Aeronautica were fighting a desperate, rearguard action against the overwhelming might of the Allied air fleets. This was a challenging theater of war, marked by intense, close-quarters combat against some of Germany's most experienced pilots. By the time he was barely in his mid-20s, Curdes had established his dominance. On May 19, 1944, flying near Villacidro, Sardinia, he scored a double victory, eliminating 2 German Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. His precision and audacity quickly mounted, and within less than a month of active combat, Curdes secured his 5th kill, officially achieving the coveted status of ace, a designation reserved for those who had accounted for 5 or more enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. The markings on the fuselage of his P-51, which he christened Bad Angel, were a growing tribute to his lethality. 5 small black crosses, symbols of his mastery over the German fighters. His victories, however, were not limited to the German Luftwaffe. On June 24, 1944, Curdes engaged and skillfully shot down an Italian Macchi C-202 Folgore over the azure waters near Golfo Aranci. This kill cemented his unique position as one of the few Allied aces to have victories over both major Axis powers in the Mediterranean theater. The war, for him, was a mathematical equation of targets and maneuvers, and he excelled at solving it. But the career of a fighter pilot, no matter how skilled, is always a delicate balance of fate and fortune. Curdes' luck ran out just weeks later. On August 27, 1944, during a ground-strafing mission against an Axis airfield in Greece, Curdes' P-51 Mustang took heavy defensive fire. His aircraft was critically damaged, forcing him to bail out over enemy-held territory. The experience was terrifying, parachuting into a hostile landscape. His life instantly transitioned from the controlled geometry of air combat to the chaotic reality of evasion and survival on the ground. Curdes managed to avoid capture for several harrowing days, relying on his wits and the kindness of local resistance fighters. Eventually, he was rescued by a British submarine operating off the coast, an experience that underscored the sheer fragility of life at the front. The incident was a powerful reminder that even the most successful aces were constantly a moment away from catastrophe. Upon his return to Allied lines, the typical path for a veteran ace would be a rotation back to the United States for a bond tour, becoming a propaganda symbol for the war effort. But Louis Curdes was not typical. He was hungry for combat, driven not by fame, but by a visceral dedication to the fight. He successfully lobbied for a return to active duty, accepting a transfer to a completely different theater of war. One where the enemy was fueled by a fanaticism he had not yet witnessed. He was reassigned to the 3rd Air Commando Group and dispatched to the Pacific Theater. Arriving in the Philippines in early 1945, he traded the clear blue skies of the Mediterranean for the humid, misty air of the Pacific Islands, and the veteran pilots of the Luftwaffe for the desperate, suicidal tactics of the Japanese kamikaze. Curdes knew that in the Pacific, the nature of the aerial conflict was fundamentally different. The goal of the enemy was not merely to defeat, but to destroy through self-sacrifice. He was about to confront an enemy that did not fight to live, but lived to die. His reputation as an ace was established, but his legend was about to be forged in the most extraordinary and controversial aerial engagement of his life, the transfer of Louis Curdes. From the European theatre to the Pacific was more than just a change of scenery. It was a shift from a war of attrition to a war of existential, desperate finality. It was in this new, fanatical environment that Curdes would execute the single most bizarre, ethically challenging, and yet profoundly heroic act of his entire military career. An act that would earn him an unprecedented and deeply secret victory mark, the insignia of his own nation. Upon his arrival in the Philippines in early 1945, Lieutenant Curdes found himself in a world far removed from the dogfights over Sardinia. The air war in the Pacific was characterized not by the duel between highly skilled aviators, but by a chilling, relentless defensive measure implemented by the Japanese imperial forces, the kamikaze attacks. This was a form of combat that defied the established rules of engagement, turning the aircraft itself into a guided missile aimed at the vital aircraft carriers and battleships of the U.S. Navy. Curdes, now operating with the 3rd Air Commando Group out of bases recently secured from the Japanese, quickly adapted to the new reality. He flew the P-51 Mustang, a fighter well-suited for interception duties, and he dedicated his focus to hunting down the Japanese fighters and bombers that still dared to challenge Allied supremacy, including the terrifying kamikaze threats. His personal aircraft, the Bad Angel, now sported the rising sun flag alongside the German crosses and the Italian tricolour. The environment demanded constant vigilance. Every aircraft that appeared on the radar was a potential weapon aimed at the heart of the U.S. fleet. It was during this period that Curdes demonstrated the lethal efficiency he had honed in Europe, adding Japanese victories to his tally. His skills were not just in flying, but in the rapid, accurate identification of threat and the immediate execution of a firing solution. The stakes were astronomical. A single kamikaze that slipped through could inflict catastrophic damage and kill hundreds of sailors. However, the most extraordinary challenge to Curdes' judgment did not come from a Zero fighter or a Val dive bomber. It came from an unexpected and seemingly impossible source. The date was February 10, 1945. Curdes and his wingmen were flying a routine patrol over the waters of Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines, an area that had recently been the scene of intense fighting. The sun had set, and the patrol was operating under the cloak of a tropical night sky, a period of heightened alert, as the Japanese often preferred the cover of darkness for their desperate transport and reconnaissance missions. As they flew over the calm, dark bay, Curdes' sharp eyes detected an aircraft flying at low altitude. Crucially, the aircraft had its navigation lights on. This was immediately suspicious. In a war zone, no Allied pilot would fly with lights illuminated unless they were in a designated safe zone or making a distress approach. Curdes immediately attempted to contact the aircraft, cycling through standard Allied challenge codes via his radio, but received no response. His pilot intuition screamed danger. He executed a careful low pass, pulling up alongside the mysterious aircraft. The truth of the situation was a psychological shock. It was a Douglas C-47 Skytrain, a standard U.S. Army Air Force's transport plane. Yet the non-responsive transport was flying a course that would take it dangerously close to Japanese-held territory. Curdes was immediately faced with two terrible possibilities. The aircraft was lost and about to fall into enemy hands. Or far worse, it had already been captured by the Japanese and was being used for a sinister mission, potentially to observe or attack the vulnerable Allied positions. Before Curdes could fully process the impossible sight, a new critical element was introduced to the scene. His wingman spotted a faint glimmer on the water's surface a short distance away. Descending for a closer look, Curdes confirmed the identity of the light source, a life raft. In the raft, tossing gently on the dark waves, were 4 American airmen, survivors of a previous mission, waiting for rescue in an area becoming increasingly active with enemy patrols. The discovery immediately transformed the C-47 from a mere curiosity into an immediate, lethal threat to those men in the water. If the C-47, flying with its lights on, continued its course, it would alert Japanese coastal patrols and naval units to the exact location of the 4 vulnerable, defenseless American survivors. Capture, torture, or execution for the men in the raft would be the highly probable consequence. Curdes was suddenly standing at the intersection of conflicting military mandates and deep moral obligation. The imperative to save 4 American lives from certain capture clashed violently with the sacrosanct rule: never fire on a friendly aircraft. Yet in that dark bay, the C-47 was a greater threat to Allied lives than any Japanese patrol boat. He had to make an immediate decision, one that would guarantee the protection of the men in the water, even if it meant risking a court-martial and a lifetime of controversy. He acted decisively. Curdes fired a burst of warning shots across the C-47's nose, a desperate attempt to force the pilot to alter course or turn on the correct identification signal. The C-47 continued on its trajectory. Curdes fired again, this time disabling one of the C-47's engines, hoping to force it down safely. Still, the transport aircraft, now smoking, pressed on towards the Japanese-controlled shoreline. The fate of the men in the water hung in the balance, tied to the actions of the pilot they thought was their rescuer. There was no more time. The decision was instantaneous, calculated, and terrifyingly cold. Sacrifice the C-47 to save the men in the water. For Lieutenant Louis Curdes, an ace whose career was built on impeccable judgment, this moment transcended all standard military protocol. The C-47, flying with its lights on toward Japanese lines and ignoring all warnings, was a navigational threat that would reveal the vulnerable location of the American survivors. Curdes pressed the firing buttons on them. Control stick of his P-51 Mustang, the 650 caliber machine guns on the Bad Angel roared to life, spitting streams of tracer fire into the tropical night. Curdes aimed with precision, targeting the C-47's remaining engine. The large transport aircraft, already compromised from the previous warning bursts, instantly caught fire. It spiraled down, not with the explosive violence of a fighter plane, but with a labored heavy glide, eventually splashing down into the dark waters of the bay near the Bataan coastline. Curdes circled the crash site, his heart pounding not from the adrenaline of the kill, but from the immense gravity of his action. He had just shot down an American transport plane. His mind raced, calculating the consequences: certain reprimand, possible court-martial, and the moral burden of having destroyed a friendly aircraft. Yet, as he monitored the crash site, he saw the result of his desperate gamble. Flares blossomed from the wreckage, and a second life raft was deployed. The crew of the C-47 had managed to escape the sinking fuselage. The situation was chaotic, but the threat to the original survivors had been neutralized. The C-47 was silenced, its lights extinguished, and the Japanese patrols had not been alerted. Curdes and his wingman remained airborne, orbiting the 2 life rafts, one carrying the 4 original survivors, and the other the crew of the C-47 he had just downed. They had to ensure the safety of all those men until Allied rescue units could be scrambled and directed to the location. It was a surreal moment. Curdes had simultaneously placed his own career in jeopardy and executed a brilliant, selfless act of mass rescue. The true twist in this incredible tale came only after the survivors were recovered by U.S. Navy patrol boats several hours later, when the airmen from the downed C-47 were debriefed. Curdes' name immediately surfaced. His actions, shooting down a friendly aircraft, were investigated at the highest levels. Curdes was immediately summoned to explain his egregious violation of the rules of engagement. His defense was simple, yet profound. He presented the facts: a non-responsive lit aircraft flying directly toward vulnerable, exposed American survivors who would have been captured or killed by the alerted enemy. His action, though a violation of the rule, "do not fire on Allied aircraft," was in full alignment with the higher moral obligation: protect American lives at all costs. He had sacrificed a plane to save 8 men, including the 4 who had been in the original life raft. The investigation board was faced with an extraordinary dilemma. They could not officially endorse the action of shooting down a friendly aircraft, but they could not ignore the heroic intent and the undeniable result. The official decision was a masterpiece of military bureaucracy. Lieutenant Louis Curdes was given credit for the kill of the C-47. The destruction of the transport was recorded as a necessary operational measure to prevent a greater catastrophe. He was not charged, but quietly commended for his decisive action and moral courage. The result cemented Curdes' place as the most unique ace in U.S. history. By the end of his tour, the tally of victories painted on the fuselage of his P-51, the Bad Angel, was truly singular: 7 German, 1 Italian, 1 Japanese, and 1 American. This final controversial marking was the quiet, hidden proof of his ultimate act of heroism. Curdes remains the only American ace with confirmed aerial victories over all 3 major Axis powers, and the only one to have a blue-on-blue kill count that directly saved 8 American lives. This secret victory became the defining, whispered legend of Louis Curdes' career, proving that in war, sometimes the most heroic act is the one that breaks all the rules. The incident involving the C-47 in the darkness of Bataan Bay marked the end of active aerial combat for Lieutenant Louis Curdes, but it confirmed his status as an unparalleled figure in military aviation history. His final official victory tally, though often omitted in public summaries, was a testament to his service across all major theaters of the war. By the war's end, the nose of his P-51 Mustang, the Bad Angel, carried the quiet, indelible marks of a career written in contradiction: 7 German crosses, a single Italian tricolour, a few rising sun flags representing his victories over the Japanese imperial forces, and discreetly noted in some records the acknowledgement of the American C-47 kill. This made him the only pilot to have achieved the status of ace, with victories over the primary fighting forces of the entire Axis coalition, a feat that showcased his lethal adaptability. Curdes was not the highest-scoring ace of the war, his record of 9.5 enemy aircraft destroyed, the half being a shared German kill, placed him firmly within the ranks of distinguished flyers, but it was the diversity and ethical complexity of his final tally that set him apart. He possessed a rare blend of mechanical flying skill, tactical patience, and most importantly, the decisive moral courage to act against protocol when human lives were at stake. This unique blend of qualities meant his story was, for decades, kept outside the mainstream of public war narratives, deemed too complex or too contradictory for simple propaganda. Following the close of World War II, Curdes remained briefly in the military, but the intensity and immediate life and death stakes of combat aviation had passed. Like many veterans, he faced the immense challenge of transitioning back to civilian life, a life where the clear-cut decisions of a fighter pilot, friend or foe, shoot or save, were replaced by the ambiguities of peacetime existence. The man who had been a hero in the sky, famed for his audacity, returned home to a quiet anonymity. He eventually left the service, returning to his native Indiana. While he occasionally recounted his exploits to friends and family, the full, complex narrative of his service, particularly the controversial nature of his final recorded kill, remained largely confined to military archives and the close circles of veteran pilots. He went on to pursue a successful civilian career, But the war, particularly that singular night over Bataan, remained an indelible part of his identity. The quiet of his later life stood in stark contrast to the blazing intensity of his youth. The pilot who had faced down both the Luftwaffe and the kamikazes with equal ferocity became simply Mr. Curdes, a respected member of his community. The urgency of war was replaced by the rhythm of civilian work, and the adrenaline of the dogfight was traded for the calm of domestic life. However, the legacy of the bad angel persisted. Among aviation enthusiasts and military historians who dug deeper than the headline figures, Louis Curdes' name was synonymous with an unprecedented kind of heroism. His story served as a powerful reminder that the true nature of courage in war is not always about following the letter of the law, but about adhering to a higher moral imperative, a narrative perfectly suited to the ethos of century of war. His decision, once considered a potential act of insubordination, is now celebrated as an extraordinary act of selfless leadership, a hidden gem of valor from the vast, complex tapestry of the Second World War in the Pacific theater. For decades following the war, the full accounting of Louis Curdes' aerial victories remained a story relegated to specialist circles and military record keepers. His achievement, becoming an ace over multiple Axis powers, was impressive enough. But the final confounding tally mark, the American C-47, was the detail that guaranteed his story would never comfortably fit into the patriotic wartime narratives. This ambiguity created a quiet historical enigma that took decades to unravel. The military, recognizing the heroic intent but needing to maintain the clear lines of command and safety, chose a path of minimal exposure. Curdes' actions were internally lauded for saving the lives of the 8 men involved. Yet the nature of the kill was not publicized, ensuring that the critical principle of do not fire on friendly aircraft remained sacrosanct. This necessary institutional ambiguity, however, meant that one of the most remarkable acts of moral courage in the Pacific War remained largely obscured from public view. The rediscovery of Curdes' story was driven by the tireless work of aviation historians and enthusiasts who, in the age of accessible military records, began to scrutinize the unique victory markings painted on the fuselages of famous wartime aircraft. They noted the bizarre 4-nation tally: German, Italian, Japanese, and American. The anomaly was too stark to ignore. When the full story of the non-responsive C-47 and the stranded airmen in the life raft was pieced together, Curdes' action was reframed from a possible transgression into a profound act of moral calculus. The core of the legend rests on the ethical dilemma Curdes faced in that moment of darkness. He did not simply shoot down a plane. He made a life-saving exchange. He calculated that the immediate, certain risk to the 4 original survivors, their capture, torture, or death at the hands of alerted enemy forces, outweighed the procedural violation of engaging a friendly aircraft. His fire was a controlled act of operational self-sabotage, an immediate and surgical solution to prevent a far larger human tragedy. This facet of Curdes' life elevates his narrative beyond a simple tale of combat skills. It transforms him into a symbol of decisive, autonomous leadership under extreme pressure. Unlike the stories of aces who relied on sheer firepower or speed, Curdes' final kill was a victory of judgment and conscience. It affirmed that the human element, the protection of vulnerable comrades, must sometimes supersede the rigid doctrines of warfare. Today, Curdes' unique record is celebrated precisely for its contradictions. The blue-on-blue victory is not a stain on his service, but the highlight of his moral profile. His action proved that a soldier, even in the frenzy of the Second World War, can retain his ethical compass and utilize his lethal skills not for blind destruction, but for preservation. The final, strange marking on the bad angel is thus seen as a secret badge of honor, representing the complexity, the tragedy, and the quiet heroism that permeate the history of the century of war. The full story of Lieutenant Louis Curdes is a powerful testament to the layers of complexity embedded within the grand narrative of the Second World War. His life, from his youthful zeal as a fighter pilot over Europe to his critical, rule-breaking decision over the Pacific, provides a unique lens through which to examine the true nature of courage. Curdes ultimately transcended the traditional definition of an ace. His final and most controversial victory cemented his status not as a mere scorer of kills, but as a hero of conscience. He utilized the destructive capabilities of the P-51 Mustang to achieve an objective of preservation, choosing life over protocol in a moment where lives were hanging by a thread in the dark Pacific waters. This decisive moment of moral clarity, where he consciously fired upon a friendly target to prevent an enemy capture, remains a narrative benchmark for ethical leadership under duress. His unique tally, the 7 Germans, the Italian, the Japanese, and the American, is more than a curiosity. It is a profound historical signature. It encapsulates the global nature of the war he fought, highlighting his presence across every major theater where the U.S. was engaged. More importantly, the American mark serves as a whispered badge of honor, acknowledging an act of service that was too extraordinary to be ignored, but too problematic to be celebrated publicly during the immediate post-war period. In his later years, even in anonymity, Curdes contributed to the historical record simply by his existence. His memoirs and the subsequent historical investigation into his life have preserved a vital, albeit complicated, piece of WWII aviation history. His story contrasts sharply with the fanaticism he faced from the kamikazes, the Japanese pilots who embraced death for duty, by showcasing an Allied pilot who valued the preservation of human life above all else, even above his own career security. The saga of the Bad Angel and its solitary American kill is a fitting conclusion to a career dedicated to the violent, yet necessary, defense of freedom. Louis Curdes passed away in 1995, but his legacy, slowly brought out of the military archives and into the public eye by those who valued truth over simplicity, continues to challenge our understanding of wartime heroism. He remains the only ace to have claimed victory over all 4 belligerent groups. A hero defined not by the enemies he vanquished, but by the American lives he ultimately saved with the most difficult shot of his entire life. His legacy endures as a powerful, yet contradictory, reminder that the most essential battles of the century of war were often fought not just with steel and fire, but within the conscience of a single individual.